Okay, so we are now recording. We're now live, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, again to this LRAC lecture. What I'll be talking about over the course of the next sort of three quarters of an hour to an hour is this phenomenon of 60s revolution and modernisation. And I'm using 1964 essentially as a kind of snapshot of the politics and the culture of the time. In particular, in the second half of the lecture, I will be concentrating on the matter of modernisation as a kind of a political concept and as a football that kind of gets kicked around between different parties at the 1964 general election. It's a very broad term, and it encompasses everything from sort of technological change through cultural change, economic change, political change, and of course changes in people's lifestyle as well. Um, uh, it's important because the two main parties go into the general election with contrasting policies about modernisation and even more contrasting leaders themselves. So from the Conservative side, you had the recently elevated Sir Alec Douglas-Home. Um, and he struck a particularly old-fashioned figure against the relatively young and relatively dynamic, or at least dynamic seeming, Harold Wilson, who was the leader of the Labour Party. And you'll see that I use this term 60s revolution. I've used it in the title periodically. It will pop up over the course of the lecture. And I also use the term cultural revolution as well. But I want to stress that I don't consider though that revolution, in inverted commas, to have been as it is popularly imagined or as it is portrayed rather glibly in the media today. So there's a kind of a myth of a 60s revolution, which is used, I think, in a far too offhand way in the press and broadcast media in this country and elsewhere, indeed. And that's not how I'm really conceptualizing this revolution, quote unquote. Instead, I think of it as a period of cultural change. It took an awfully long time from start to finish. It is far longer than the 1960s decade, so that 60s revolution phrase is kind of misleading. And it's certainly, at least at this point in time, in the early 60s, not evenly spread across the population. Nevertheless, there are spikes of relatively rapid cultural change in this period, and the period around 1964 and the general election itself is kind of a crucible there. It's arguably one of those points at which there's a crystallization of relatively rapid cultural change. So, insofar as there was a revolution occurring in British life in the 1960s, the focus for that revolution, most people would doubtless now say, was youth, as young people. And of course, that's because the images of the 60s that we most readily recall stem mostly from youth culture. So it's Beatlemania, it's Woodstock, it's mods and rockers and so forth, which spring to mind. And that's all rather monocausal, of course, but since it's the most well-known feature of the cultural change that I'm going to be talking about, it seems right that I should begin with it here. Now, as it happens, policies towards young people were only a minor issue at the 1964 general election. Hopefully you can see that's the first of the slides, and periodically you'll see a little arrow pop up as I move around between the slides there. Now that's partly because the age of majority was still set at 21 in 1964. The first general election to take place where the voting age has been reduced to 18 is 1970. And in fact, only the Liberal Party favoured lowering the voting age to 18 in 1964, and only they made any specific appeal to the young, and they produced a pamphlet called The Charter for Youth in the run-up to the 1964 election. But actually, votes for teenagers were positively opposed by virtually all sections of the public, as you can see there, 61% of all voters from the NAP survey. And in fact, by rather more Liberal supporters, curiously enough, than Labour or Conservative ones, as it happens. So kind of odd there. But that doesn't mean that youth and youth policies and the attitudes towards young people that's irrelevant to the election or indeed to politics in general. In fact, the perceived excesses of youth were, in a sense, causing a feeling of moral fright amongst some sections of the public at this time. So, for example, take this from 24th of May 1964. This is a leader column in the Glasgow Sunday Mail. And as you can see there, for years we've been leaning over backwards to accommodate the teenagers, accepting meekly on the radio and the television that it is their music which dominates the air, and that in our shops it is their fads which will dictate our dress styles. We have watched them patiently through the wilder excesses of their ban the bomb marches and smiled indulgently as they've wrecked our cinemas during their rock and roll films. So there we go, the spirit of John Knox there coming through loud and clear from the Glasgow Sunday Mail in May 1964. Of course, this is hyperbole, and besides that, it confounds two rather separate issues there. On the one hand, youth culture, and on the other, the campaign for nuclear disarmament, which is by no means solely a youth movement. But nonetheless, this text here is quite interesting because its very existence is indicative of a kind of moral panic that is kind of embedded in British society about young people's transgressions, or at least their seeming transgressions. The historical sociologist Stanley Cohen noted that this type of disapproving language is indeed very common in the provincial press around this time. So why does this occur now? This piece is written in the first instance in response to the teenage mods and rockers riots, which occurred at Clacton, Margate and Brighton on successive bank holidays in April and May. And it appeals to a fear that those disturbances might indeed spread nationwide. Here's the there's the mods in Clacton, fearsome, as you can see, terrifying, and you can see the police cowering away from those terrible ruffians. But there was a fear that those disturbances may spread nationwide. But those events simply provided a focus for an otherwise widespread but kind of nebulous fear of youth culture. You can see, if we just go back to the previous slide very quickly, how the leader column there mashes together a number of different trends that were clearly not directly connected to the bank holiday rampages. That conflation of different areas creates for the reader a sense of a generational conflict, which is present in all levels of civil society. But there is evidence that such attitudes are not just the product of deliberately sensational journalism. And indeed, to begin with, the public exhibits a fairly healthy skepticism about the mods and rockers issue. So, for example, in the first Gallup poll taken after the Clacton disturbances in April, Clacton was the first place that there was a mods and rockers riot. And it showed more than half of the sample in that poll thought that the newspapers were exaggerating the seriousness of the events that had occurred. Then we had the Margate and the Brighton incidents over the Whitsun holiday, and then more still in Hastings and Great Yarmouth. Those occurred in August. And by that point, only a quarter of the Gallup poll thought that um, the press was sensationalising the story. So that was quite a change in public attitudes, seemingly, of course. It's easy to dismiss opinion poll findings naturally as a kind of a ephemeral reaction to contemporary concerns, but there is clearly a growth in public anxiety, and it's the trend in those polls that matters more than the exact figures. In fact, there's quite a lot of angst over what you might call sliding moral standards, or at least perceived sliding moral standards in 1964. Everything from a very bad reaction to the launch of the topless bathing suit, believe it or not, in June of 1964. That elicited a 77% disapproval rating on Gallup, to the launch of Mary Whitehouse's Clean Up TV campaign, which soon had, or at least was claiming to have, hundreds of thousands of members. That's another phenomenon that occurs in early 1964. The supposedly lax attitude of youth towards sexual relations, allegedly encouraged by popular music and television, is what's driving forward that moral backlash. So when Dr. Peter Henderson, the Chief Medical Officer of the Ministry of Education, declared in August 1963 that young couples were not unchaste, wonderful use of language, if they had sex before marriage, there's an enormous indignation about his remarks. And again, a Gallup poll taken shortly after he makes these comments shows that only 17% of the public had any kind of sympathy with that view. So that's still an enormous reservoir of kind of moral fright or potential condemnation of what's happening, ostensibly at least, amongst within youth culture. But in truth, actually, the sexual revolution, at this stage at least, wasn't really a revolution at all. Not by 1964, it wasn't. Michael Schofield, who was the research director of the Central Council for Health Education, discovered in his survey entitled "The Sexual Behaviour of Young People" that in fact only 20% of boys and 12% of girls in his teenage sample admitted to any experience of sexual intercourse. So instead, the magnifying effect of the media, coupled with kind of moralist campaigns like that of Mrs. Whitehouse, lent to these developments a kind of infectious moral urgency, if you like. It's hardly surprising, I suppose, that the moralists were kind of making advances, and people were becoming increasingly worried about the laxity of youth behaviour, if you like. So you see a lot of images like this in the press in the early 60s. So there's the Beatles there, the Beatles, the old Beatles stockings. Wonderful addition to anybody's wardrobe, I'm sure. So these things are kind of not uncommon in the media at this point, and it's so pop music, fashion, teenage sexuality. These are all part of the essential ingredients in the popular mindset, at least, of this new youth decadence, in inverted commas. And press headlines doubtless add to this feeling of moral degeneration, justified or not. So I'll give you this as an example. This is the Daily Mirror from May 1964. This is kind of typical of the way in which the press tends to report not only the modern rockers disturbances, but a lot of other potential kind of transgressions of youth in inverted commas. On the back of this one, the Margate disturbances, the Daily Sketch called these dissolute youngsters a byproduct of the welfare state mentality, the attitude that whatever you do, there is a great government finance safety net to prevent you falling on your face. There was also a lot of press attention given to a survey on drug taking and sex that was conducted by the Brighton Council of Youth at the time of their mods and rockers riots. Those of you who know where I live will recognise that I have to have some mention of my hometown in practically every lecture or seminar I ever give. And that's this Brighton Council of Youth survey reveals, probably quite dubiously, that 62% of mods and 42% of rockers had tried drugs, and that 73% of male mods, 28% of female mods, 60% of male rockers and 12% of female rockers admitted to having had sex. You might want to think about the arithmetic of that for a bit, given that the male figures are considerably higher than the female figures. But anyway, it's for our purposes, it's not really whether the figures themselves were accurate. It's that the findings got a lot of press attention, and they kind of supported an idea of a collapse in young people's morals, and this is all entangled with this kind of pill-popping, degenerate, aggressive youth lifestyle. So, clearly then, rebellious youth is seen as a serious threat by some elements of society. And as The Economist puts it, the possession of a scooter and peculiar clothes is beginning to be taken as a sign of moral iniquity. Many people, perhaps not easy to define, but to some extent consisting in generally the middle-aged or elderly who still held to the moral certainties of the pre-war period, felt that certainly something very unpleasant was happening in Britain. And equally unsurprising was the reciprocal loathing for the older generation on the part of the young. In 1964, again, an interesting book called Generation X was published, and this contained oral testimony from young people across Britain. I should point out, this is quite interesting as an aside. We are now used to referring to the generation who kind of partook of this quote-unquote 60s revolution as being baby boomers. That's how that generation is generally these days referred to in the press. And the term Generation X usually refers to the group of people who are born from the mid-60s through to the early 80s instead. So it's quite interesting to see that Generation X as a phrase has kind of shifted. That label has shifted over time. But anyway, there we go. This is one quote from this book. This is from John Braden, and he had participated, or claimed to have participated, in the Mods and Rockers events at Margate. You want to hit back at all the old geezers who tell us what to do. I hope you like my marvellous kind of London accent there. I'm imagining this, that this is how this gentleman spoke. You want to hit back at all these old geezers who tell us what to do. We just want to show them we're not going to take it. It was a battlefield. I felt great, part of something important, instead of just being something they look down on just because you ain't passed GCSE. Oh, sorry, that's GCE, of course. I apologise. I know some old men were knocked down, but none of them was hurt. They might have got a shock, but they deserve it. They don't think about us. And then you get a lot of similar types of quotes in this book. This is from Tony Misen. He's a 16-year-old from Liverpool. Sadly, I can't do a Liverpool accent, so actually, probably a blessed relief to you all. There's too much jealousy over teenagers, and it stems from the old people. They hate our guts, and if they can't intimidate us the way they did in the past, that's why they attacked the Beatles. There's lots of sexual jealousy goes into it. Goodness. Now, this, of course, suggests a state of a kind of ongoing tension between young and old, which may be somewhat overplayed, but is there to some degree. Um, and there's a sense that, at least amongst the former group, cultural change is too rapid and too uncontrollable. Um, but nonetheless, we must be careful of painting with too much in the way of broad brushstrokes. For some, the pace of change was frightening and liable to promote moral collapse, and for others, it was almost glacially slow. This is a remark made by one of my former students who was in his late teens in 1964. There's not interviewed for the book, the Generation X book, but nonetheless of a similar age. He said, the papers were all full of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I wondered why I saw none of this. Then I realised it was probably because I lived in Nunn Head. That's, hopefully most of you will know where that is. It's in South London. And so there's a kind of a sense of boredom as well, alongside this public picture of out of control, wild, excitable youth. There is that sense of boredom of other people elsewhere having a more exciting time, and you see that too in some of the entries in the Generation X book. So, for example, I wouldn't choose Carlisle, reflected Walter Bell, who was another 16-year-old. There's not much to do here. I go to the pictures, I play snooker in a billiards hall. I've seen a few nice girls I'd like to know, but I haven't got round to talking to them. You just don't get much chance. And there's the two sides of this thing. One side is the big public push for a wild, expansive, liberal youth culture, but on the other hand, the grim reality for an awful lot of people, young and old, is one of a relatively kind of mundane existence, which is one of the reasons why I said right at the very beginning, 60s revolution, kind of glacial, far in some ways, and certainly unevenly spread. Nor indeed should we assume that the rebellious behaviour of young people had any political intent. Now, it's true that the mods did choose European styles of dress, and with Blue Beat, was a kind of a Jamaican influenced style of music, but they engaged very little with politics per se. The late Tony Benn provided a telling example of this anti-political apathy in his diaries of the time. He recalled a visit to a youth club in 1964 at which he was required to take a question and answer session, and wrote that they listened politely, but when I had finished, they all got up and went back to their dancing. I wished I hadn't come. I do sometimes wonder if the young people really are supporting us. They were also despondent about Britain and believed nothing would really change. Or, to put it another way, and going back to Generation X, politics don't interest us. I think they're a real old mess. And that's according to Roger Smith, a 19-year-old from Birmingham. It seems that this was recognised by the politicians at the time, although I've put the pages of my notes in the wrong order. So apologise, everybody. Okay, I'm back. So as I say, it seems that this is recognised by the politicians at the time, but although the young socialists managed to hand the Tories a propaganda triumph. The Young Socialists, in case you're unaware, are the youth section of the Labour Party at the time. Well, when they produced a leaflet entitled "Up the Mods, Up the Rockers," which gave a completely spurious political slant to the Whitsun disturbances. And then Conservative Central Office claimed rather opportunistically, but nonetheless effectively, that the Labour Party's youth section was itself completely out of control. So what I'm saying here is that all those events might look something like, a cultural revolution, if you like, but it wasn't, or at least not a very evenly spread one. But what is important, is the perception in the media then, and indeed even now, um, of what these events, what these changes in behaviour, what the kind of imagery associated with youth culture. That's far more important for what I'm about to discuss, the perceptions rather than the actual realities. And it's because youth rebellion created such alarm across amongst certain section of the public that it actually restricted freedom of movement on policy for political parties, curiously enough. Um, it was no accident that for the first time in the 20th century, crime and policing became a national issue at the 1964 general elections, according to opinion polls. So until that point, it was a negligible issue in election debate. And for some candidates, linkages between the problem of crime and the issue of youth delinquency were disturbingly simple. So, for example, the soft bed treatment of criminals has been given a fair run and it has failed. I advocate much harsher penalties, especially for those arrogant young bullies who delight in attacking and maiming the innocent, the old and the frail. And that's the Tory candidate for West Gloucestershire in his election address. So some Tory candidates, by no means all, but some Tory candidates reckoned that a moralist approach was going to be popular electorally. The launch of Clean Up TV, that's the Mary Whitehouse campaign I mentioned earlier, the reaction to the Mods and Rockers riots, and this recurring evidence of opinion polls, you'll see I've used opinion polls quite a lot there, all were pointing towards that conclusion. And the executive is also clearly aware of this. Indeed, Alec Douglas-Hume's government had already passed quite a lot of legislation to combat this supposed moral threat. Between Hume becoming Prime Minister and the 64 election, we have a series of acts, the most important of which are the Obscene Publications Act, the Malicious Damage Act, the Refreshment Houses Act, the Prevention of Drug Misuse Act. So those are just 5 examples. There are other minor things as well. So there's kind of a moral agenda that the government is at least willing to pursue under Alec Douglas-Home. And had the Conservatives remained in office, it's fairly likely that the Home Secretary would also have legislated against what was called uncontrolled dancing clubs at the time. There's certainly, if you the records in the Public Record Office at the National Archives in Kew indicates that legislation was on the cards, albeit that it wasn't really included in the manifesto for obvious reasons. Now, curiously enough, a year earlier, the Conservative Party had seemingly, at least, wanted to project a youthful, modernising image. But it was now in early 1964, it was stuck with Hume as its leader. Here's Hume as depicted by M. Wood in the Daily Mail. And this is the probably far better known cartoonist Vicky in the Evening Standard there, showing the existing members of the cabinet being somewhat flummoxed at and all with their Beatles haircuts, as you can see there. That's Quintin Hogg, and Reggie Maudlin, Rab Butler, and Selwyn Lloyd. In case you're unfamiliar with those faces, being dismayed at the arrival of Alec Douglas-Home as their new leader at the end of October in 1963. But in any case, Hume was temporarily unsuitable to be cast as somebody who was going to be driving forward social liberalism. In fact, when he became PM, he declared that no man, especially no young man, is complete unless he has learned to serve. Service is the main duty laid upon us by the Christian religion. Young people instinctively seek something bigger than personal pleasure and gain. Now, regardless of whether one thinks of that as a good and noble thing or a rather old-fashioned view, the fact is that that was the publicly stated view of the Prime Minister, and so it's awfully difficult then to for the Conservative Party to build any sort of idea of liberal, progressive, and culturally modernising politics around this new leader that they've just acquired. So essentially, the government is stuck. And the importance of appearing to support established mores and defending civil society is therefore crucial to the election chances of the Conservatives, and the party's left with little option but to play to their new leader's strengths. But youth rebellion, as we've seen, is certainly not enough to explain the Conservatives' adoption of a rather tame programme, it turns out, in the general election. We must also examine the question of modernisation, which, you're probably thinking, finally gets to modernisation. And the problem of modernisation is something that kind of saturates the politics of the early 1960s. Not always explicitly, but it's kind of there in the background throughout the period from 1961 through to the mid-60s. So what was modernisation, and why did it have such a hold over the politicians of the period? There's no time really for me to go into the deep-seated reasons for Britain's relative economic decline, but suffice it to say that the combination of imperial retreat, industrial underperformance, and the vigorous economic growth seen on the continent since the birth of the EEC was enough to make ministers feel that they had a desire to update British society. So that need to be modern to arrest this seeming decline actually explains Hume's predecessor's application, that's Harold Macmillan, to join the common market in 1961. It also explains the rapid movement, far more rapid than earlier policies, towards African decolonisation, the adoption of indicative planning as a method of macroeconomic management, and a whole host of other measures as well. And it also explains, on the other side, Harold Wilson's very public harnessing of science to socialism at his party's Scarborough Conference in 1963. So this desire, this propulsion of modernisation is key in both of the big political parties. Moreover, it's supported by some real heavyweights in the political realms. So the Times is fully behind it, has a big campaign. The Economist, possibly even more so, and even the Duke of Edinburgh is a devout public believer in the idea of modernisation. Likewise, industry and commerce are not slow to jump on that bandwagon. And computers in particular, they're seen as the future, and technology becomes the motor of change. Just in case you're not sure what I mean by a computer, that's a computer. This is Birkbeck College in 1963. So that's the kind of thing that they were introducing. It's not something that we would be familiar with today. It's not a handheld device. But it's not really an exaggeration to say that one could barely open a serious newspaper in this period without seeing somewhere on its pages a major company announcing that it had acquired a computer. So, for example, here, we probably don't really really appreciate the kind of gratuitous sexual imagery there, but this is quite an interesting image, nonetheless, as a source, because it intertwines the images of technology and sex, if you like, or at least yes, I guess there's no other way around it. To produce this idea of modernity, and this is very typical of the trends in British society at this point. Okay, so modernisation, if you like, is in one sense the political face of the slow burning cultural revolution, and like all the cultural developments that I mentioned earlier, it carried with it a real sense of menace in some ways to certain sections of society. The decolonisation and the EEC application, both components of that modernisation drive, they threaten the old imperial right, if you like, and also Commonwealth enthusiasts in the Tory party. The Beeching Plan, that most of you will remember the Beeching Acts, or at least know of what the Beeching Acts was, which was essentially just stripping back, cutting back most of the about half of the British rail network at the time, in the belief that would make it more efficient. And that's, again, kind of part of this package of modernisation. That also attacks an established constituency, if you like, which is rural dwellers. And then there's economic modernisation measures like the abolition of resale price maintenance, that which occurs at the beginning of 1964, and that's seen as an attack on the small shopkeeper. And then there's automation and computerization, as you can see here, which seemingly imperils the jobs of both manual and clerical workers. This isn't something that just suddenly appears in 63, 64. This has been going on for a while. So, for example, this is how Michael Cummings in the Express saw that impending clash between labour and machines. The two figures in the centre who are kind of being ineffectually overwhelmed by the impending fight between these two giants about to meet. There are on the left hand side, that's Anthony Eden, Prime Minister at the time, and the opposition leader is Hugh Gaitskell there. Likewise, in the middle of the 1964 campaign, we get things like this. This is a Daily Express cartoon. Always lovely to see something by Giles, of course. This is the gypsy fortune teller is confronted by a bemused client, presumably asking for advice on who to vote for, and offering the prophecy: whichever way you vote, your job is about to be taken over by a computer. So it's simplistic, okay, but it's still nonetheless how a large proportion of the public saw this this wave of modernisation, which is kind of bound up together with a cultural revolution as well. Very difficult to kind of disentangle that in people's minds. So, for example, we got a Gallup poll in late 1963, in which 59% of the sample associate automation with machines taking over jobs. Now, that's not necessarily in itself a negative image, but it's quite hard to imagine that people are blind to that idea that computerization could cause unemployment. I think that's pretty much well known. And it's Tories who understand that best in the election campaign, if anything, and they are pretty keen to dampen anxieties that are renewed, that more modernisation means less employment. So they are very keenly promoting the idea that they are still fully committed to the policy of full employment. So unlike Labour, some kind of headlong rush into the modern age is not an option for the Conservatives in the approach to the election. You've got this dismay over the Beeching Acts. You've got this dismay over the abolition of resale price maintenance in the months leading up to the general election, and that had already ploughed deeply into Tories' natural support over the previous 9 months or more. A weak response to rebellious youngsters could well have damaged their core vote further, which is why you see those little pieces of legislation that are introduced by the Hume government. And indeed, a more progressive policy would, in all likelihood, have further alienated a significant constituency for them. The process of negotiation over manifesto content illustrates exactly this. There was an awful lot of innovative ideas that came cascading out of the Conservative Research Department throughout 1964. Conservative Research Department was kind of an internal, captive, blue sky thinking think tank, if you like. It's not that doesn't quite accurately describe exactly what it does, but it is one of the principal sources of policy generation and kind of thinking the unthinkable within the party. And some of the things that it comes up with in 1964 for to be inserted into the manifesto were decimalisation, the televising of Parliament, curiously enough, quite early on, the creation of a commercial radio network, longer shop opening hours, and legislation against racial incitement as well. So all of those were at the very least watered down, and some, like the new race relations law and the decimalisation of currency, were completely struck from the manifesto draft at a reasonably early stage. And that's not to say that necessarily pleases all Conservatives. Far from it. In fact, there were progressives like Ted Heath, who just happened to be on holiday when the manifesto was being decided, who were kind of infuriated by what had happened in the process of constructing the government's electoral programme. And he on coming back from holiday, he demands a whole series of changes, even at the risk of alienating some of the Tory vote. His quote being, what was needed was less of the lowest common denominator and more positive thinking. But it's too late. And even if the government could have changed direction by, this is happening in kind of September 1964. Even if the government could have changed direction by that point, which it probably couldn't for the reasons I've already given, then it doesn't seem likely that it would have wanted to. So the Tories go into the election promising a kind of a low-calorie modernisation, if you like, rather than this kind of rich product that Labour and Harold Wilson had to offer, in which the thorough embrace of science in order to modernise Britain. That's the Labour Party's offering, at least, ostensibly. But that's not necessarily to suggest that all Conservative candidates were willing to follow the lead of the party on that matter. Nor indeed that modernisation in moderation was at all a deeply unpopular electoral stance to take. In fact, some Tory candidates made an effort of sorts to prove themselves to be kind of fab and gear. There we go. Stay with it, yeah. By that's from W.H. Lovey's Tory candidate for Chichester, and others kind of stretched the limits of the rather wishy-washy manifesto. So we have the manifesto position on the Channel Tunnel, for example, was that the government intended to start negotiations over its construction But in the hands of Hugh Fraser, Hugh Fraser being the first husband of Antonia Fraser, incidentally, that's becomes kind of almost like a commitment to start drilling immediately. So there's some Tory candidates that do kind of hype it up a bit, or focus on the more dramatic elements of the Tory manifesto, but there aren't many. If you look at opinion poll data, interestingly enough, it's kind of surprising that the party doesn't make more of modernisation, perhaps, but I'll give you some reasons why in a bit. This is which party has the best policies for modernising Britain? NOP, National Opinion Polls, one of the only really two major opinion poll companies operating in Britain at this time. The other being Gallup, which we've already mentioned. And you can see there that this is a question that NOP starts asking at the beginning, at the end of 1963, when the Labour Party and Conservative Party are pretty close together on that measure. But by the time we get to the October 64 election, there's quite a big gap there. So the electorate does appear to trust the Tories rather more than Labour on the subject of modernisation, and this is a consistent lead which kind of widens, as I say, towards the end there. And this is despite that Wilson's white heat of technology speech makes modernisation really the standard, the big flag of the Labour Party, rather more, in fact, probably far more than that of the Conservatives. Still, so why does this Tory version of modernisation, given Labour's more overt stance and the disappointments of the manifesto for progressive Conservatives like Ted Heath, why does that seem more popular? And I think that actually the answer to that lies in the actual moderation, or the kind of the weakness, the slight wateriness of the proposals that the party puts forward in its election programme. There's no reason, in fact, to suppose that the majority of the public were keen on radical modernisation, and in fact, actually, probably the reverse. And we've seen this kind of early on with some of the reactions to rebellious youthful activities and the lifestyles of teenagers, albeit that this is somewhat confected. But it does suggest that there's a deeper reservoir here than simply that. This is kind of a shorthand, really. I couldn't really put together what's happening with youth, with economic modernisation, but they're kind of related in the sense that both of them are threatening to an established order of society. And it does seem, in fact, that when looking at this question of whether or not Britain needs modernising, only 29% of voters, according to the NOP's election survey, which you can see on the slide, feel that modernisation was urgent. And amongst Conservative voters, as you can see there, that's a lot smaller. But the moderately progressive policies of the Tories were perhaps more likely to appeal to the 52% of voters there who believed, at least ostensibly, that Britain needed some, but not drastic, modernisation. So there's a sense in which this kind of very dilute version of modernisation has some electoral attractions. The Labour Party, too, however, is constrained in its policies. Wilson had certainly stomped the country on a major speaking tour throughout the early part of 1964, repeating this message of radical modernisation powered by the scientific revolution. And in Britain, in Birmingham, for instance, he declared, "We are living in the jet age." Sadly, I can't do Harold Wilson. I wish I could. We are living in the jet. No, I can't do it. We are living in the jet age, but we are governed by the Edwardian establishment mentality. The Tories have proved that they are incapable of mobilising Britain to take full advantage of the scientific breakthrough. So, for the Labour Party, too much has been staked on that approach to change it, despite the fact that actually it may have appeared too kind of frightening in some ways to a large proportion of the electorate. So there was really no alternative for them to a platform of what you might call technological socialism. That said, this is more of a comic aside than anything else, very few Labour candidates were prepared to go quite as far as this guy. Yes. This is his great kind of advertising your approval of the Cultural Revolution, if you like, with this kind of weird avant-garde artwork. But that's quite a rarity. In fact, there's actually very little room for manoeuvre on the scientific aspects of Labour's programme. And there's some attempt to kind of rein back and to attempt to address the concerns of the public over other worrying aspects of cultural change. So, for example, very late on immigration, the leadership slides in a small caveat into the Labour Party manifesto, literally days before its publication, along the lines that Labour accepts the number of immigrants entering the United Kingdom must be limited, and so on and so forth. And it also keeps away from the manifesto largely some of its more liberal and again kind of like potentially frightening ideas of liberal legislation on things like sexual activity, homosexuality, abortion, and so forth. These are not things that the Labour Party is keen to discuss during the campaign. So this does suggest that there was some realisation in the Labour Party that voter insecurity over the pace of cultural change was a potentially potent electoral influence. But neither party is really in a position to be able to, in the modern jargon, to triangulate particularly effectively between the different voter groups that it needs to appeal to, which is maybe one of the reasons why the election turns out to be so incredibly close. The campaign itself there's not much concentration upon modernisation per se in the campaign. It's more of a background noise, to be honest. The Conservatives realise that one area in which Hume does have a marked advantage over Labour is foreign affairs. Hume had been the Foreign Secretary for a number of years before replacing Harold Macmillan in late 1963. So they tried to concentrate on that area, and Labour didn't perhaps really push the scientific revolution quite as hard as we might expect, perhaps realising that it was frightening to some people. But curiously enough, by the end of the polling period, the period leading up to polling day, you can see there at the bottom the modernisation is the blue line as a significant issue of importance. Now, of course, that's way down in comparison to cost of living, which is the highest issue of importance. But it's become more significant than foreign policy, which is quite interesting. In the month immediately before the election, and again, sometimes with opinion polls, the snapshot of data that you get from a single poll is it kind of doesn't tell us very much. But if you look at them over time, if you look at them in sequence, it can tell us quite a lot. So you've got less than 1% of the public think that modernisation is significant. It's a significantly important issue in February, which is the first time at which these questions are being asked in the run-up to the general election. And then by October, you have 16% thinking that this is a significant issue. Curiously, the launch of the Sun newspaper, not as we would remember, we know it now, but this may have been, it may have heightened the issue of modernisation. This, as it as it was then, when it was launched, the Sun is as a middle market paper. It's not a tabloid. It comes in a broadsheet in terms of its physical size, and it's supposedly a replacement for the Daily Herald, which had ceased publication earlier in the year. And it's quite kind of curious here. This newspaper has stakes its claim, or gives its raison d'etre rather, as this kind of scrupulously forward-thinking, dramatic, modern type of newspaper. And its opening page in its very first issue not only declares that we welcome the age of automation, electronics, computers. We will campaign for the rapid modernisation of Britain, but also that public taste has been uplifted. People are interested in new homes, new inventions, new foods, modern ideas, the latest car, the newest everything. For all these millions of people with lively minds and fresh ambitions, the Sun will stimulate the new thinking, hoping to produce amongst its readers the leaders of tomorrow. And this is launched, as I say, that's the first edition. It's kind of plumb in the middle of the campaign for the general election. So there may have been a certain kind of focusing of minds, at least around the idea of modernisation. On the back of that, launched as it was with some fanfare. I mean, it didn't do very well, actually, for a long time, which is why ultimately it gets bought up by Rupert Murdoch and turned into a tabloid. But there we go. The Sun does support the Labour Party at the election, but its impact's probably very slight because it comes very, very late, and also because its circulation is relatively small to begin with, although it makes it this big fanfare when it launches. But the manner of the paper's launch, which is indicative of the extent to which cultural change was beginning to spread through British society. What it doesn't show is the extent to which that vision of the modern Britain, if you like, was a contested one. I think I have tried to show that is a contested vision. And in some areas, it is an actively opposed one. So ultimately, what do I conclude? Clearly, cultural and economic change is a reality in the Britain of 1964, and its impact is evident on both major parties and the general public at large. Yet its spread through society is a long way from complete, and even more far from universally welcome. The snapshot of this year, that is 1964, suggests that it is not at all certain that this quote-unquote revolution will continue. Indeed, the narrowness of Labour's election victory suggests that the balance of forces between liberal so-called progressives on the one hand, on the other, the upholders of older moral certainties, was extremely fine. It would be a historical fallacy to claim that the Tory party was the embodiment of what later to become known as moral rearmament. Far from it. But nonetheless, and partly in consequence of its deliberate avoidance of anything that smacked of radicalism during the election, it was the repository of many votes from the still existing very large constituency of what you might call the illiberal, the reluctant, and I suppose ultimately the simply anxious, those anxious about change. Labour's victory instead ushered in a legislative climate which was marginally more conducive to modernisation and liberal cultural change. But still, this revolution had a long way yet to run. Okay, that's me done.